Well, after a few weeks of ignoring the short-lived hype train for Outriders, I finally decided to do a deep dive for you and check out the game, to see whether it lives up to the whole "is this game the next big game" mantra that a lot of people, especially fans of Destiny or The Division, have been hoping for. I don't think any of you will be overly surprised to hear me say that Outriders didn't exactly fulfill that incredibly high quality bar. In fact, it missed by such an astronomical margin that to suggest any comparison between it and the other two aforementioned games would be a direct and significant insult to said games. After almost 15 hours of playing this, I can't even bring myself to try any of the endgame content. I am just so tired of forcing myself to play to find some kind of overarching value in this game, something to inspire me to keep on going. If I wasn't planning to put a review video together, I wouldn't have even bothered finishing even half of this game. I've already gone over the story in my last video, when I covered the demo that was released a few weeks ahead of the full launch, so I'll just reach back in my time machine and show you a little blast from the past. Take it away past me. So moving on from the story, let's talk about some of the things this game gets right, before we turn our attention towards the inevitably longer list of things it does not get right. The first thing that comes to mind is the loot system. I tend to be somewhat mixed on the whole looter-shooter formula. I think for some games like Destiny 2 it can work really well and actually enhance the overall gameplay experience, assuming the weapons and other loot you add actually stand out. Say what you will about Destiny 2 as a game, but when it comes to guns, everything from the model design to the firing and reload animations, to the sound design for each weapon, etc., Bungie has really mastered the art of making every weapon they invent feel and sound differently than the rest, which is no easy thing to do as a developer, when you consider the mere number of weapons added in as loot to that game, which easily numbers well into the hundreds. Remnant from the Ashes had a similarly good assortment of weapons, albeit a significantly smaller number compared to other games like Destiny, obviously. But these positive examples are few and far between compared to the vast majority of looter shooters, whose weapons and armor pieces seem specifically designed to be as overly generic and forgettable as possible. The weapon loot in Outriders is fantastic. I've had very little trouble quickly mounting a massive collection of loot. You could easily max out your backpack carrying capacity, aka acquire a good 30 or 40 weapons, in a meager handful of hours. It's not uncommon in my experience to walk away from a boss or mini-boss fight with half a dozen or more newly acquired weapon drops. And that doesn't even include the individual weapons you earn from completing story missions and other activities. The boss fights were another really great component of this game that I do want to give the developers full props for. More than half of the bosses I fought in Outriders were multi-phase bosses, which was pretty cool. While you could obviously tell it was scripted in every possible way, I really enjoyed the spectacle nevertheless. Were they perfect? No. Were they mind-numbingly fun? Absolutely. And considering that's exactly what I expected from this game, I wasn't overly disappointed in that regard. I'd say my favorite was fighting the giant fire spider monster in the volcano. I'm not really afraid of spiders, but I don't really like them either, so I have zero qualms about killing an enormous Aragog-sized one. There are a couple of other good bosses. There's a giant Godzilla-esque monster that liked to spray energy out of its mouth and kept trying to bitch slap me with its hand. Aside from those two, I'd say the other bosses I played against were decent but unremarkable. The voice acting in this game was another thing I felt was fairly well done. And voice acting is a fairly important aspect in any narratively driven game. If you can close your eyes and always be able to tell who's who, just based on the voice acting, that's good voice work. If you can only tell the characters apart from one another because of their appearances and not their voices, then you've got some pretty terrible, overly generic voice actors. Luckily, that's not the case for Outriders. Now that we've exhausted that fairly short list of net positives, let's turn to the negatives. And trust me, we'll be here a while. Starting with the most painfully dreadful aspect, the optimization. You'd be hard-pressed to find a single AAA game in the past year that's as buggy and borderline unplayable as this one. I would say it comes just shy of beating Marvel's Avengers in that regard. Certainly it's even buggier than that Resident Evil 3 remake, and that game couldn't even launch properly on most computers without a community-made mod fixing the issue. You would think with the insufferable number of loading screens in this game, and we'll get to the loading screens in a moment, but you'd think with all those opportunities for loading, that the game wouldn't nearly always require additional loading time, but you'd be wrong. Almost every time I enter into a new area, I have to wait anywhere from 15 to 60 seconds for the game to begin functioning normally. I had to manually turn the graphical settings down from ultra to a mix of medium to high, just to be able to get this game to run at an acceptable frame rate, at least most of the time. Whenever I enter a new arena, I can by default expect the frame rate to drop to anywhere between 5 FPS and 20 FPS, which is completely unacceptable considering I'm running this game off an SSD, as well as a NVIDIA 2070 RTX graphics card, 16GB of RAM, and a high-functioning Intel Core i7-7790K CPU. This is a beast of a computer, so if Outriders can't function at an acceptable quality standard on this PC, I have no hesitation in saying good luck to anyone trying to run it on something that isn't a high-end gaming PC. I've died over 24 times during boss fights because the game decided to freeze just as I was dodging a boss attack. Anywhere from 5 to 30 seconds goes by, and in a split second the game starts working again. I find myself always inexplicably insta-killed by the boss. Because apparently the whole soft crash thing only applies to me and my character, not to anything else in the world. I don't mind dying due to my own stupidity, but I do mind dying as a result of things that are utterly and completely out of my control, like the game's own technical failings in being able to properly render a boss attack without resulting in a near-fatal crash. Now, earlier I mentioned the voice acting is pretty good. However, I deliberately avoided the obvious caveat, being the utterly terrible lip-syncing, and the cringe-worthy edgelord-style dialogue. If there's one thing I wish someone would have taught the dialogue writer of Outriders, it's that simply adding the word fuck to every single uttered sentence does not make your game or your characters cool. But maybe that's a fucking lesson in fuckery that would be completely lost on such a fucking emo fuckhead that's probably never spoken to another fucking human being since fucking middle school. Yes, I just risked demonetization to prove the obvious point. Swearing in narrative-driven entertainment like books, films, or games can work quite well, as long as you don't overuse it, and more importantly, you have to use it effectively at the right moments. Take a look at Samuel L. Jackson's character in Pulp Fiction. He swears quite a bit in basically every scene he's in, but when he does so, it's to illustrate a point or for comedic effect. It works because Tarantino understands how dialogue is supposed to work. Simply swearing for the sake of swearing in conversations where it doesn't really fit is really noticeable, and not in a good way. Moving on, there's lots of other notable gameplay affecting issues. Sprinting is completely broken. Turning too sharply will immediately result in the character breaking to a walk. But if you try to tap the shift key to begin sprinting again, the game will act as if you wanted to break from a sprint to a walk, as if it didn't recognize you being in a walk already. The only way to get back to sprinting is by spamming the shift key a number of times and hoping that Windows doesn't instantly close the game window to ask whoever you want to enable sticky keys. I also experienced lots of clipping issues with character models and other odd model-specific issues. At some points, character faces appeared to not even be rendered in high definition. Several times I even ran into enemies whose heads were partially or even completely invisible. After over 15 hours of grinding through this miserable mess of a game, I simply could not bear to continue trudging through this abysmal exercise in futility. I know some people might say, well, you have no right to review a game until you've finished, but when a game is so dreadfully uninteresting and outright broken in every possible conceivable way, to the point that it regularly becomes unplayable, I have no regrets in not continuing to endure this travesty of a game. In all complete honesty, I would have been more than happy to stop playing at a mere 4 or 5 hours in, but I felt it was my moral obligation as someone attempting to review this game to stick with it as long as I could, preferably all the way to the end. I can't justify putting myself even through one single more minute of this. I've played plenty of bad games, and while I and mostly everyone else agree that they're bad, many bad games can still be enjoyable from an ironic point of view. The whole it's so good it's bad mentality. A few examples I can think of off the top of my head would be Rambo the video game, Spartans vs. Zombies Defense, or The Fall in the Sun. But I'd rather spend 15 hours playing any or all 3 of those games than spend another 15 hours stuck in this poorly optimized and loading screen-laden hellhole. On that note, that's where I think I'm going to wrap it up for today. I think you can gather what my opinion of Outriders is based off this rather short video, but let me know what you think of Outriders in the comments down below. Maybe you guys feel a bit differently and maybe more lenient on the game and its developers than I am, or maybe you've come to the same conclusion as me. Either way, I'll be curious to hear what your thoughts are and debate it with you in the comments section down below. If you want to support the work I do in this channel, do consider subscribing and clicking the bell to opt into getting notifications whenever a new video goes live. I record new game reviews, first impressions, and other gaming critique related content every week. As we're still just barely into the second quarter of 2021, there hasn't been an enormous number of interesting games to review. Also, I'm currently a full-time student and part-time retail worker, so there's that too. But as we get further into the year, I expect the game release calendar will start to ramp up once again. That said, this is WarriorDan signing out. Stay awesome everybody, stay safe, and peace out.